The tin hit the hardwood floor before anyone in that room understood what they were looking at. 23 birthday cards. Some yellowed, some still crisp, a few with the ink gone soft and gray with age. They slid across the parlor floor of my grandmother's house like something scattering after a gunshot, and for one full second, nobody moved. Not my stepmother, whose hand was still in the air from knocking the tin off the side table. Not my father, standing by the cold fireplace with his mouth already opening to say something that wouldn't help. Not the lawyer, who had a folder of numbers in his lap that were about to blow the family apart worse than any card ever could. I'm Natalie, and I was 38 years old, kneeling on my dead grandmother's floor, when I found out exactly how much love a person can hide in a box for 23 years. What I pulled out of that tin an hour later is the reason my stepmother hasn't spoken my name since. Not out of hatred. Out of arithmetic. If you've ever been the one in the family everybody quietly agreed to stop mentioning, the one who got the story told about them instead of the chance to tell it themselves, you already know the feeling in your chest right now. That specific, cold, low hum of, I always suspected this, and I hated myself for suspecting it. Stay with me. This one has a name at the end. Its name is Ernest. Welcome back to Betrayal House. I'm Natalie, and this channel exists for one reason, because too many of us were told we were the problem in a story we never got to read. If that's you, hit subscribe, because what I have to tell you tonight isn't really about my $17 million grandmother. It's about the 23 years she spent trying to reach me, and the woman who made sure every single letter died in a drawer. Let me take you back to where it actually started, because the tin didn't begin as a weapon. It began as a Tuesday afternoon at a kitchen table, with a woman who smelled like Estee Lauder and pipe tobacco from a husband 40 years gone, writing my name on an envelope in handwriting so careful it looked like she was carving it. I was 7. My mother, Marguerite, was still alive then, and Beaufort, South Carolina still felt like the safest 13,000 people on Earth. We lived 4 streets back from the water, close enough that on still nights you could hear the marsh breathing, that low, wet exhale of pluff mud at low tide, a smell most people call ugly, and the rest of us call home. My grandmother Vera Ashworth lived 2 blocks over in the house her own father built, a tabby brick place on Bay Street with a magnolia in the yard older than the state highway system. Every Tuesday, my mother dropped me there while she ran errands, and every Tuesday, Vera let me sit at her kitchen table and watch her write. "What are you writing, Grandma Vera?" "A card for you, child, for when you're older than you are today. But it's not my birthday." "No, but it will be, 23 more times, whether either of us is ready for it or not. So I'm getting a head start." She sealed it, wrote a number on the back corner in pencil, the year, and dropped it into a Danish butter cookie tin that lived on the top shelf of her pantry, behind the good china nobody used. I asked her once why she didn't just give them to me each year like a normal grandmother. "Because normal isn't the same as certain," she said. "I want you to have proof that showed up whether I was still standing here or not. You're my Ernest child. You understand that word yet?" I didn't. I was 7. I nodded anyway, the way children do when a word sounds important enough to pretend to understand. That's the first piece I need you to hold on to. Ernest. It will matter more than anything else in this story. And I promise you, when it finally lands, it's going to land like a legal document, because that's exactly what it is. My mother died 2 years later. Ovarian cancer, caught in the kind of late stage where the doctors use the word comfortable instead of the word cure. I was 9. I remember almost nothing from that year except the smell of the casserole dishes stacked on our counter that nobody was eating, and the sound of my grandmother crying in a bathroom with the fan on, thinking no one could hear her over the fan. She thought wrong. I could hear everything in that house that year. Grief makes children into microphones. 14 months after the funeral, my father remarried. Her name was Carla Winslow, an insurance broker with a laugh that arrived half a second before anything was actually funny, and a way of rearranging a room the second she walked into it, moving a chair here, a photograph there, until the house looked like a house she'd always lived in. She was, to be fair to her, not cruel to me in any way you could point a camera at. She packed my lunches. She came to my school plays. She was, for years, Simply there. In the particular way a landlord is there. Present, responsible, and never, not once, mistaking the property for hers to lose sleep over. It was about 8 months into the marriage that I learned the sentence that would define the next 23 years of my life. I was supposed to be asleep. I was sitting at the top of the stairs instead, knees against my chest, because I'd heard my grandmother's name in the kitchen and some instinct in me, the same instinct that would later make me good at my job, told me to listen for what wasn't being said as much as what was. Carla was on the phone with her sister, my Aunt Peggy, voice low and certain, the voice of someone explaining a decision she'd already made and was only informing people about as a courtesy. Look, Vera's never going to be the grandmother that girl needs. Not after Marguerite. Every time she looks at Natalie, she sees her daughter dying all over again. It's cruel to keep dragging that child over there. I'm doing everyone a favor. I held this family together after Marguerite died, Peg. Desmond couldn't get out of bed for a month. I get to decide who's still in it. That includes deciding this isn't good for Natalie, whether Vera likes it or not. I didn't understand every word. I understood the shape of it. I understood that something was being decided about me, in a kitchen, without me, by a woman who'd known me for 8 months, about a woman who had loved me my entire life. 3 days later, the Tuesday visits stopped. I asked why. I was told Grandma Vera needed space. Then I was told she'd said something upsetting about me at church and didn't want visitors confusing the situation. Then, over the years, the story sanded itself down into something simpler, something I could carry without asking follow-up questions. Grandma doesn't really want a relationship with you, sweetheart. She never got over your mother. Some people just can't separate the two of you in their head. It isn't about you, except it is about you. But it's not your fault. 23 years of that sentence, delivered in a dozen different soft voices, is its own kind of erosion. You stop being a person who was cut off from someone who loved her. You become a person nobody particularly wanted. That's the quiet, permanent damage nobody warns you about. Not the single dramatic wound, but the slow resurfacing of the same bruise. Every holiday, every missed call, every, she's just not up for visitors this year. Was it me? Was there something wrong with me that made my own grandmother not want me? I asked myself that question so many times between the ages of 9 and 32 that it stopped feeling like a question and started feeling like a fact I'd simply been told about myself early and had to accept, the way you accept your blood type. I want you to remember that question. Hold on to it the way I held on to that tin. It gets answered tonight, and the answer is not what 23 years of my life trained me to expect. There was exactly one person who kept me from disappearing into that story completely, and her name was Odessa Pratt. Odessa ran a bookbindery and paper conservation studio 2 doors down from what used to be my grandmother's favorite church, a narrow shop that smelled like wheat paste and old glue, and faintly of the cigarettes she'd quit in 1994, but whose ghost lived permanently in her cardigans. My grandmother used to bring me there before everything changed, back when Tuesdays still belonged to us. Vera had a standing account with Odessa for repairing the family Bible, a monstrous, water-damaged thing with a spine that had cracked sometime during Reconstruction. I used to sit on a stool in the corner and watch Odessa work with a scalpel finer than anything in my mother's sewing kit, easing a torn page back into a shape it remembered being. After the visits with Vera stopped, I kept showing up at that shop anyway, walking the 6 blocks alone once I was old enough, because it was the one place that still smelled like before. Odessa never asked me a single question about my family. She just handed me a brush and a jar of rice starch paste and told me to earn my seat. "You want to know a secret about paper?" she asked me once, when I was maybe 15, elbow deep in a water-stained ledger from a shrimping company that had gone under in the 70s. Paper never lies. People get very good at lying to each other, but paper just sits there and holds whatever the truth was the day someone wrote it down. My whole job is finding the version underneath the damage. You'd be amazed how often it's still legible, if you're patient and you don't rush the reveal. I fixed my first document alone at 16. A torn marriage certificate a widow brought in, crying, because it was the only proof she had that 40 years of her life had actually happened. When I handed it back to her, whole again, she held it against her chest like a child. Something in me clicked into place that day that has never come loose since. I understood, with the clean certainty you only get a handful of times in a life, what I was going to do with mine. Odessa took me on as an apprentice properly at 17. Over dinner she cooked for me most weeks that year, because, though neither of us said this out loud until much later, she'd figured out there wasn't a lot of dinner being made for me at home. She taught me everything: deacidification, Japanese tissue repair, how to read a watermark, how to tell real ink aging from a forger's chemical bath. She also taught me the thing that mattered more than any of it. Somebody's going to try to convince you someday that the story they're telling is truer than the paper, she told me the week I left for conservation school in Charlotte. Don't believe them. The paper was there. The paper doesn't need to be believed in. It just needs to be found. I built a life on that sentence. I want you to remember it too, because it comes back at the end, and when it does, it's going to be doing more work than you expect. There was one more thing Odessa gave me before she ever let me touch a client's document unsupervised, and it's small enough that I almost don't mention it, except that it turned out to matter more than almost anything else she taught me. She made me practice patience on things that couldn't be rushed, no matter how badly I wanted them fixed. A water-warped photograph that needed 11 days of controlled humidity before it would lie flat again. A torn deed that had to rest under weighted blotting paper for a full week before the fibers would even accept new adhesive. You'll want to force it, she told me, watching my hands hover over a piece I was clearly itching to finish in one sitting. Everybody wants to force the healing. Paper punishes you for it every time. It tears worse, or it dries crooked, or the ink runs somewhere it shouldn't. The people who are best at this job are the ones who can sit with something broken and not touch it again until it's actually ready. I didn't know yet how much I'd need that lesson for something that wasn't paper at all. By 38, I had my own studio in Charleston, 40 minutes up the coast from Beaufort, low country paper and book conservation, a converted carriage house with humidity control. I'd installed myself and a client list that included 2 university archives and a state historical society. I restored ship's logs and slave manumission papers and water-damaged love letters people found in dead relatives' attics. I was good at it. Careful, patient, exact. The same qualities that had made me useless at pretending my family situation was fine had made me excellent at coaxing the truth back out of ruined paper. The month before Vera's stroke, without knowing it meant anything at all yet, I took on a case that I now think was the universe rehearsing me for what was coming. A family in Mount Pleasant brought me a water-stained trust document their late father had drafted, arguing bitterly over what a smudged clause actually said, each sibling swearing the ink favored their own memory of what he'd promised them out loud. I spent 6 days lifting the document under magnification, layer by layer, before the original wording came back clean enough to read. It didn't say what any of them remembered. It said something plainer and kinder than either version, the way the truth usually does once you stop asking it to take a side. I remember thinking, as I handed it back to 2 adult siblings who'd stopped speaking to each other over a rumor, that most family wars aren't fought over what a document says. They're fought over what people have convinced themselves it must say, because the real thing was never in front of them to check. I filed that case away and didn't think about it again until I was standing in my grandmother's parlor with a folder of my own. I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel is about honesty even when it costs something. I had made peace, or told myself I had, with the shape my family had settled into. My father and I spoke on birthdays and at Christmas, careful surface conversations that never went anywhere near 2003. Carla and I were cordial in the specific way 2 people are cordial when neither one wants to be the reason a room gets uncomfortable. Julian, my half-brother, Carla and my father's son, born about 2 years into their marriage, I saw at the occasional holiday. A sweet, easily overwhelmed kid who grew into a sweet, easily overwhelmed man. Still living 12 minutes from his parents. Still working for the family's construction business. Still calling his mother every day at lunch. And Vera, I hadn't seen in the flesh since I was 9 years old. I sent a card every year. Out of some stubborn muscle memory I never let myself examine too closely. I never once got a reply. I told myself that meant something final. I was wrong about that, and I didn't find out how wrong until the phone rang on a Tuesday in April. It was my Aunt Peggy, Carla's sister, a woman who called me maybe twice a decade and always sounded slightly nervous doing it. like she was breaking a rule. "Natalie, honey, I don't know if anyone's told you. Vera had a stroke back in February. She's been in the memory care wing at Bay Point since March. I only found out myself last week. Carla's been handling everything, and I guess it slipped through the cracks that some of us weren't told. Slipped through the cracks. My grandmother had a stroke, and the information reached me fourth hand, 2 months late, through a woman apologizing for a leak she hadn't caused. I called my father. He confirmed it, in the flattened voice he used whenever a subject bordered Vera or Carla, or the space where those two things overlapped. He said Carla had power of attorney, had for years, ever since Vera's eyesight started going and she needed help with the checkbook. He said it was under control. He said, and this is the sentence I wrote down on a sticky note the second I hung up, because something in my hands already knew it mattered. "There's no reason for you to get involved, Nat. It would just upset her. Carla's got it handled." 6 weeks later, Vera Ashworth died in her sleep at Bay Point Memory Care, 89 years old, and I found out about my own grandmother's death from a public obituary posted online by the funeral home, a full day after it happened. I didn't cry right away. I want you to understand that, because I think it says more about the previous 23 years than any single memory could. My first feeling wasn't grief. It was a strange, quiet vindication, the kind you feel when a fear you've carried since childhood finally, fully arrives, and some tired part of you thinks, there it is. I always knew this is how it would end. Uninvited from the ending, same as I was uninvited from everything else. Carla called 2 days later, her voice arranged into something gentle and regretful. "Natalie, honey, of course you're welcome to come to the service. I know things have been complicated. I just want you to have realistic expectations going in. Vera made her peace with how things were a long time ago. The will's already settled. I wouldn't want you driving down here expecting some big surprise. She loved you in her way. She just made her decisions a long time ago. I said I understood. I said I'd come to pay my respects. I hung up, and I sat very still at my work table for a long time, next to a 17th century property deed I'd been humidifying flat that morning, and I thought about all the ways a sentence can be technically true and still be built entirely out of someone else's decisions dressed up as mine. I went to the funeral. I sat in the third row, in a navy dress I'd bought that morning because I hadn't owned funeral clothes for a person I'd stopped being allowed to grieve in advance. Carla sat in the front row in black, receiving condolences like a woman accepting an award. My father sat beside her, silent, the way he'd been silent for 23 years, a man who had apparently decided somewhere along the way that neutrality was the same thing as kindness. Julian sat on Carla's other side, red-eyed, genuinely wrecked. He'd grown up thinking of Vera as a kind of distant, disapproving relative, and I would learn later exactly how much of that impression had been manufactured for him, too. After the service, Carla mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Harlan Reyes, Vera's longtime estate attorney, would be reading the will at the house on Bay Street the following Saturday. For whoever wants to be there, though I really don't think there's much to discuss, it's mostly formalities. She said it while refreshing her lipstick in a compact mirror. I remember that detail because it's the kind of detail Odessa taught me to notice. The small, unbothered gesture happening underneath the big, performed one. A woman that, unconcerned about a reading, either already knows exactly what's in the will or has convinced herself she does. I decided, sometime between the funeral and my drive back up to Charleston, that I wasn't going to walk into that reading with only my questions. I was going to walk in with an attorney of my own. Harlan Reyes was not who I called. I found my own lawyer first, a probate specialist in Charleston named Dana O.C., who'd handled a dispute for one of my archive clients. And it was Dana who first sat me down and explained, in the plainest terms she could manage, what I was actually entitled to know. "Here's what people don't understand about power of attorney," she told me. Legal pad in front of her. Radiator in the corner of her tiny office clanking every few minutes like it had something to add. A POA lets someone manage another person's finances while they're alive. It is not a magic password that erases the paper trail. Every check, every withdrawal, every transfer, it all exists somewhere in an account statement, whether the person managing it wants it found or not. And here's the part that matters for you specifically. Once Vera passed, and once the will was filed for probate, any named beneficiary, and until we see that will, we don't actually know if you are one, has the legal right to request a full accounting of how her assets were managed under that power of attorney. Not a favor, a right. And if I'm not a named beneficiary, then it gets harder, but it doesn't go to zero. If there's a reasonable basis to suspect financial elder abuse, South Carolina law allows interested parties, and a grandchild qualifies, to petition the probate court for an accounting regardless. This isn't sneaking. This isn't hacking anybody's email. This is asking a court, politely and with paperwork, to make someone show their math. I remember sitting with that word. Math. 23 years of being told a story, and here was a woman telling me the story had never mattered, because underneath every story is a ledger, and ledgers don't lie the way people do. Saturday came. Harlan Reyes read the will at the house on Bay Street, in the same parlor where I used to sit at Vera's feet while she talked to visitors, in front of my father, Carla, Julian, Aunt Peggy, and me. I'm not going to make you wait for that scene. I'll get to it in full soon, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you this. But I need to tell you what happened in the 2 weeks after. That reading first, because that's where the real proof was built. One document at a time, the way I build everything. Dana filed the accounting request the following Monday. It took 11 days for the first batch of bank records to arrive, and when they did, I sat at my own kitchen table, not Vera's, mine, in Charleston, at 11 at night, coffee gone cold beside me. And I went through 6 years of statements from Vera's primary checking account, the same way I go through a damaged manuscript. Slowly, in order, looking for the tear before I decided what kind of repair it needed. The first thing I found was a recurring monthly transfer, dated back to the spring of 2020, right around the time Vera's eyesight failed enough that she needed real help. Labeled simply, Family Caregiving. $35.66 a month, every month, for 4 straight years, then bumping to just under $4,000 in the 5th year. I added it up twice, because the first total scared me, and I wanted to be wrong. I wasn't wrong. $214,000, paid out of my grandmother's account to Carla Winslow, over roughly 5.5 years, for caregiving services. The second thing I found, 3 folders deeper, was a name I didn't expect to see at all. Denise Calloway. A separate, much smaller line of payments, also labeled Caregiving, $1,200 a month, paid directly from Vera's account to a woman I'd never heard of. I called the memory care facility the next morning, and a kind administrator named Marisol confirmed what I already suspected in my stomach before I'd finished asking the question. Denise Calloway had been Vera's actual in-home aide for 4 of those 5 years, before Vera moved into full-time memory care. The woman who bathed her, fed her, sat with her through the confused, frightened hours after dark that come with dementia. Denise had been paid $1,200 a month by Vera directly. Carla, meanwhile, had been paid nearly 3 times that every month for coordinating care she had, according to Marisol's own scheduling records, visited to provide in person an average of 6 times a year. Not $50,000. Not a suspicious lump sum easy to explain away as a loan. $214,000, drawn slowly enough, steadily enough, that Vera, declining, frightened, dependent on the one person managing her checkbook, would never have had the clarity left to question it. That was the sword. I didn't have the shield yet. But 3 nights later, going through an older box of statements Dana's paralegal had pulled from a dormant account, I found it, and it was smaller in dollar terms, and somehow worse in every other way. In 2003, the year I turned 15, Vera had opened an education and keepsake trust in my name. $50,000, structured to release to me at 18. Then, according to a handwritten amendment in the file, in Vera's own careful hand, held longer, at Natalie's father's request, until she is more settled. I had never once been told this fund existed. Between 2005 and 2011, 6 withdrawals had drained it down to $3,500. Every withdrawal had been authorized by Carla. Under a secondary power of attorney, Vera had granted her in 2004. The same year, I would later learn, the visits fully stopped for good. $46,500 of it was gone. Some had gone to administrative fees. A large piece of it, $17,000 in a single 2009 withdrawal, had gone directly into a 529 college account belonging to Julian Okafor. My brother's education, funded in part by money my grandmother had set aside for mine, moved by a woman who told a 9-year-old her own grandmother didn't want her anymore. $46,500, plus $214,000. $260,500 total, over 21 years, moved out of a woman's account by the one person she'd trusted to hold the pen for her. I sat with that number for a long time that night. Not because it was a lot of money. Against a $17 million estate, it barely registers as a rounding error, and I want to say that clearly, because I think it's important. This was never about the size of the theft. It was about what the theft proved. Somebody had been managing my grandmother's money and my grandmother's story, at the exact same time, with the exact same hand, for over 2 decades. The woman controlling the checkbook was the same woman controlling what I was allowed to believe about being loved. I need to stop here for a second, because I think some of you already feel this in your chest, and I want to sit with it before I keep going. If you have ever quietly wondered whether the family member managing everything, the money, the story, the access to someone you loved, was managing it a little too conveniently for themselves, you are not paranoid. You are paying attention. Comment the word cards below if any part of this is landing somewhere real for you, because I read every single one, and I promise you, this isn't the strangest version of this story I've heard. It's just the one I lived. I'm going to pause the countdown for just a second and go back to the will reading itself now, because I told you I'd get there, and everything I just laid out for you is the proof that made what happened in that parlor mean something more than a family argument. But before the proof, there's a piece of pressure I have to tell you about, because Carla did not simply sit still once she realized what an accounting request meant. The first sign came through Julian. He called me on a Wednesday, voice careful in the way it gets when someone's been coached without quite realizing they've been coached. Nat, I know things are weird right now. Mom's really struggling with all this. Can you just maybe not push so hard on the whole records thing? She held everything together after your mom died. She's not perfect, but she's not some villain. It would mean a lot if you'd just let this go for the family's sake. I told him gently that I loved him, and that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, and that I needed to understand what had actually happened to my own grandmother before I could let anything go. He didn't push. He also didn't stop calling every few days, each time a little more anxious, clearly caught in a current he didn't fully understand yet. The second sign came 10 days later, in the form of a phone call from Carla herself, warmer than she'd been in years, offering, unprompted, to just settle this like family, without lawyers dragging it out. She proposed a lump sum, $20,000, so you have something now instead of waiting on probate to grind through, in exchange, she said, for not putting everyone through an ugly accounting process that's going to hurt people who don't deserve it. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, hurt who exactly? She said Julian. She said my father's health. She never once said her own name. I didn't take the money, and I didn't yell at her either. I've spent my whole professional life learning that you don't rush a reveal. You let it come forward on its own schedule. Somewhere in that same stretch of days, I started getting texts from cousins and family friends I hadn't heard from in years. Not hostile, exactly, but each one carrying the same careful shape, like they'd all been handed the same 3 talking points and told to distribute them gently. A cousin from Colombia wrote to say she just hoped I knew how much stress this was putting on everybody, especially with Desmond's blood pressure. A woman from Vera's old church group messaged to say she'd always heard Natalie had her reasons for staying away, but surely now wasn't the time to make things ugly. I hadn't spoken to either of them in a decade. I understood, reading those messages back to back at my kitchen table, that Carla wasn't just managing me. She was pre-building a jury, one gentle, unbothered message at a time, the same way she'd once managed a 9-year-old's understanding of an entire family. It didn't work the way it used to. If anything, it did the opposite. Every one of those messages was a name I quietly added to the list of people who deserved to see the actual numbers before they finished deciding what kind of person I was. The third sign is the one that actually broke the case open, and it happened by accident, the way these things almost always do. Carla, it turned out, was not a woman comfortable with modern phones. She'd recently switched carriers, and her new voicemail service auto-transcribed every message and emailed the text to a saved contact group labeled, apparently by a technician who set up her phone for her family. A group that, through some setup error nobody caught for months, still included an old address of mine from years earlier that I'd never gotten around to removing from a shared family calendar invite. 9 days before the will reading, a transcribed voicemail landed in my inbox, sent to my Aunt Peggy, meant for her ears only. I want to read you the transcript exactly as it arrived, spelling errors and all, because a machine wrote it down with no stake in how it made anyone look. Peg, it's me. Look, I already told Harlan I don't want this dragging out. She doesn't need to know Vera changed her mind about her again. It's kinder this way, honestly. I held this family together, Peggy, for 23 years. I get to decide what's fair after everything I've carried. Call me back. I read it 4 times. Then I sat down, and I finally cried. Not for the money, not even really for myself. I cried because a 9-year-old at the top of a staircase had heard almost that exact sentence, word for word, 23 years earlier, and had spent every year since wondering if she'd misunderstood it. She hadn't misunderstood anything. The sentence hadn't changed even slightly in 23 years. That's the part that undid me. It wasn't cruelty in a single moment. It was a philosophy, held so long and so comfortably that it came out of her mouth the exact same way twice, decades apart, like a scripture she'd never once had reason to doubt. Vera changed her mind about her again. I called Dana immediately and asked her what that phrase could possibly mean, since as far as I knew, Vera had never once, in 23 years, had the chance to change her mind about anything regarding me. Dana went quiet on the phone for a second. "Natalie," she said, "I think you need to see the actual will before Saturday. I think Harlan may have sent Carla an advance copy as a courtesy, given the POA, and I think that voicemail means Carla already knows what's in it." The night before the reading, I drove to Beaufort instead of straight home. I didn't go to my father's house. I went to Odessa's, because there are some nights you don't get through on your own competence, and I needed someone who'd known me since before any of this had a dollar amount attached to it. She was 81 that year, moving slower, hands more careful with a needle than they used to be. But the shop still smelled exactly the way it had when I was 7. Wheat paste and old paper, and the ghost of cigarettes she'd quit before I was born. I told her everything, the money, the fund, the voicemail, the word Vera used to write in every single card. Ernest. Odessa was quiet for a long time, turning a piece of aged Japanese tissue over in her fingers, like she was deciding whether it needed repair or whether it was, in fact, already whole. "You know why Vera loved that word so much," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "It's an old real estate term, before it was ever anything sentimental. Earnest money. A deposit you put down on something to prove you're serious about it, that you're not walking away. Vera used to buy and sell property her whole life, back when your grandfather was alive. She told me once she picked that word for you on purpose. She wasn't just saying you were precious to her. She was telling you, every single year, in writing, that she'd put something down to prove she wasn't walking away, that the deposit was already paid. Whatever happens tomorrow, Natalie, you need to understand. That woman never once withdrew her earnest money. Somebody just made sure you never saw the receipt. She took my hand. The same hand that taught me to hold a bone folder at 7 years old, and she said the thing I'm going to ask you to remember for the rest of this story, because it comes back at the very end, and it deserves to land twice. Paper never lies, sweetheart. People just get very, very good at hiding what they wrote on it. Tomorrow you don't do anything but let the paper speak first. You'll know when it's your turn. I slept 4 hours that night. I dressed carefully the next morning, the way you dress for something you already know is going to be photographed by memory whether a camera is there or not. I did not bring my own children. Some rooms aren't for them yet. I drove to Bay Street with Dana's number in my phone and a manila folder in my bag that I had checked and rechecked and checked once more in the driveway. The the way Odessa taught me to check a repair before you let a client see it. The parlor was full when I arrived. My father by the cold fireplace. Carla on the settee, dressed like she was attending her own vindication. Julian by the window, pale, jaw tight. Aunt Peggy in a corner chair, clearly regretting every phone call she'd ever made to either side of this family. Harlan Reyes at the small writing desk that used to hold Vera's stationery, folder open in front of him, glasses low on his nose. He started with the will itself. I want you to notice the order, because it mattered more than anyone in that room but me and Dana understood in the moment. He read the shield first. Vera Ashworth's estate, valued at just over $17 million, restated in a will executed in 2019, 5 years after the education fund had already been drained, which meant she'd done this with full, documented knowledge that something had gone wrong long before she had the language to prove what. 65% to her granddaughter, Natalie Okafor, $11,050,000. 25%, $4,250,000. To her grandson, Julian Okafor, 10%, $1,700,000. To the Beaufort Historical Preservation Society, in memory of her late husband. Attached to the will, in an envelope Harlan had been instructed not to open until the reading itself, was a letter in Vera's own hand, dated the same year. To my Natalie, Harlan read, and his voice, a courtroom voice for 40 years, cracked slightly on my name. If you are hearing this, it means I did not get the chance to say it to your face, and for that I am more sorry than any amount of money will ever repair. I want you to know something plainly, because I have learned this family does not always deal plainly. I have never once, not for a single day since you were born, regretted loving you. Whatever you were told, however it was explained to you, it was not true, and it was not from me. I wrote to you every year because I could not reach you any other way, and I needed there to be proof, somewhere, that I never stopped trying. You are, and you have always been, my Ernest. I did not walk away. I was kept from the door. I did not say anything yet. Odessa's voice was in my head. Let the paper speak first. Carla's face had gone the particular gray of someone doing fast arithmetic behind a still expression. She recovered quickly, the way people who've managed a room for 23 years always do. That's a beautiful letter, she said, and her voice had exactly the practiced warmth I remembered from childhood phone calls I wasn't supposed to overhear. But we all know Vera wasn't herself those last few years. I think we need to be realistic about whether a woman with cognitive decline should really be writing checks like this, emotionally, without anyone protecting her from being manipulated by people who suddenly show up wanting a piece of a big number. There it was, the exact shape of the story I'd been handed at 9 years old, refitted for a room of adults. She didn't mean it. She was confused, and if anyone benefits, it must be because they manipulated her. I opened my folder. I laid out the sword second, the way Dana and I had planned, because you establish the right to be in the room before you present the bill for what it costs to keep you out of it. I laid the bank statements on the coffee table, one at a time, the same unhurried way I lay a damaged document flat before I ever pick up a scalpel. The $214,000 in caregiving stipends. Denise Calloway's $1,200 a month beside it, for actual, documented, daily care. Denise, who I had arranged to be present that day as a witness, sat quietly by the door and confirmed, when Harlan asked her directly, exactly how many hours a week she'd spent with Vera compared to how many Carla had logged. 6 visits a year, Denise said simply. I was there most days. I didn't know she was getting paid that much to coordinate. I got $1,200 a month for actually doing it. I laid down the education fund next. $50,000 2003. $46,500 of it gone by 2011. $17,000 of that traced directly into a 529 account belonging to Julian Okafor. Julian made a small sound from the window, like something had been physically knocked out of him. Last, I laid down the transcript. I read it aloud myself, in my own voice, not letting the machine's flat text carry the weight of it. I held this family together, Peggy, for 23 years. I get to decide what's fair after everything I've carried. The room went very still. Carla's mouth opened once, and for the first time in 23 years, Nothing polished came out of it. "You don't understand what it cost me," she said, and her voice had lost every bit of its practiced warmth, gone thin and sharp, and for the first time, completely honest. "I held this family together. After Marguerite died, I kept this house running. I kept Desmond upright. I managed Vera's whole life for 20 years, while everyone else got to just love her from a safe distance. I get to decide who's still in it. I earned that." She said it proudly. She said it exactly the way she'd said it into a phone 23 years earlier, and exactly the way a machine had transcribed it 9 days before, not realizing, even as it left her mouth a third time, that she had just confessed, out loud, in front of witnesses, to a philosophy that a signed legal document had just spent 5 minutes dismantling piece by piece. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. Odessa's voice was still in my head, and so, for the first time in a long while, was a sentence of my own, one I had first whispered to myself in my car outside a probate lawyer's office, half believing it, like a prayer you're not sure yet has an answer. "You don't hold a family together by cutting pieces off it," I said. "You held a checkbook together. That's not the same thing, and I think some part of you has known that for 23 years, or you wouldn't have needed to say it out loud so many times to convince yourself." I looked at the papers on the table, then at her. "You didn't lose me, Carla. You spent me. $46,500 of my education, $214,000 of a dying woman's trust, and 23 years of a story that wasn't true, and I think the only thing I actually need to say to you is that I finally know the exact price. I just added it up." Aunt Peggy was crying quietly in the corner chair. My father hadn't moved from the fireplace, hadn't said a single word this entire time, and I understood, watching him, that this particular silence was its own kind of answer, one I'd been given for 23 years, and had simply never let myself read correctly. It was Julian who spoke next, and it's Julian's voice, not mine, that I need you to hear clearest in this whole story, because the truth that finally breaks a lie like this rarely comes from the person who was hurt by it. It comes from the person who was fed it. He crossed the room, knelt by the coffee table, and picked up the $17,000 withdrawal statement with his own name attached to the account it landed in. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at his mother. "You told me she didn't care about me, or Nat, or anyone but herself in that big house," he said, voice shaking. "You told me Grandma Vera was cold, that she pushed everybody away, that Nat chose to stay gone. My whole life, Mom, I believed every word of it. And some of my college was paid for out of money you took from my sister without telling either of us it existed." Carla reached for him. He stepped back. "You lied to me too," he said. 23 years, and I believed every single word. That's the sentence that actually ended it. Not mine. Not the bank statements, though God knows they made it undeniable. Her own son, in front of everyone she'd spent 2 decades convincing, standing in the wreckage of a story she'd built for both of us, refusing for the first time in his life to hand her the last word. It was in the scramble right after that, Carla reaching for the coffee table to gather the papers back up, Denise stepping in without thinking to stop her, my father finally moving from the fireplace, too late, as always, that the tin came off the side table. 23 cards, scattered across the floor of the room I'd once sat in at 7 years old, watching a woman write my name in careful pencil on the back corner of an envelope. Nobody said anything. I got down on my knees, the same way you kneel over a damaged manuscript, and I gathered them, corner by corner, before I did anything else. Some things you rescue before you finish the argument. I'm going to tell you what happened after, because I promised you at the start that this wasn't going to end tied up in a neat bow, and it hasn't. That's part of what makes it true. Carla did not go to prison. Financial elder abuse cases rarely end that dramatically, whatever true crime television has trained us to expect. What happened instead was slower, and in its own way, more exact. A restitution claim, filed by the estate against her personally, for the full $260,500, is still moving through probate court as I record this. It may settle, it may not. Dana tells me these things can take years, and that I should make my peace with an outcome I can't fully control. because the paper trail exists regardless of what a courtroom eventually decides to do with it. I have. Some accounts just take longer to close than others, and I've learned I can live with that particular kind of unfinished. Denise Calloway received from the estate directly a settlement equal to what she should have been paid all along, backdated with interest. She sent me a card afterward, an actual mailed card, the kind almost nobody sends anymore, that just said, "Thank you for seeing the actual math. Most people only see the story." I have it framed in my studio now, next to the tools Odessa gave me the day I finished my apprenticeship. Aunt Peggy and I talk more now than we did in the previous 20 years combined. She told me, the last time we spoke, that she felt like a fool for carrying Carla's version of events for so long. I told her what I told everyone in that parlor before I left it that day, because it was true, and because it was the only thing that let all of us actually walk away from that room instead of just leaving it. I don't blame the people who believed a story they were told for 23 years by someone they trusted. I blame the person who kept telling it. Julian and I are rebuilding something, slowly, on his terms as much as mine. He still works for the family construction business, still lives 12 minutes from the house he grew up in, still calls his mother most days, because you don't stop loving someone the day you find out they lied to you. You just stop handing them the parts of yourself they haven't earned back yet. I told him what I needed him to hear, and only that. When you're ready to stand on your own, come find me as your sister, not as a bank. That door stays open either way. He hasn't taken me up on it yet. I think he will, eventually. Some doors just need to stay unlocked longer than we'd like, without anyone standing behind them checking the clock. My father has not called. Not once, since the reading. Not on my birthday, which came and went 6 weeks later. Not for any reason at all. I used to think a silence like that was a puzzle I hadn't yet solved, a code I could crack if I just found the right approach. I've stopped believing that. Some silences are simply the answer. Delivered the only way certain people know how to deliver an answer they're too ashamed to say out loud. I've made my peace with that too, mostly. Some days more than others. That's honest, and I'd rather give you honest than tidy. I framed the 23 cards last month, in a shadow box lined with acid-free museum board, the same materials I use on every piece of history that walks through my studio door. Each one restored where the years had been unkind to it. Humidity treated, deacidified, the ink stabilized so it will outlast every one of us in that parlor that day. It hangs above my work table now, where I see it every single morning before I pick up a scalpel. Odessa came to see it the week I finished. She stood in front of it a long time, the way she used to stand in front of a difficult repair before deciding where to start. "Paper never lies," she said again, the same sentence she gave me at 17, except this time she added something new to the end of it. "It just waits for somebody patient enough to go looking. You were always going to be the one who went looking, Natalie. I knew that the day you fixed that widow's marriage certificate and didn't rush the reveal. Some people are born knowing how to wait for the truth instead of rushing past it. If there is one thing I want you to carry out of this story tonight, it's this. The people who write you out of a family don't usually do it with a single cruel sentence you can point to and say, 'There, that's the moment it happened.' They do it slowly, one soft explanation at a time, over so many years that, by the time you're old enough to ask real questions, the story feels less like something that was done to you and more like something you simply are. It isn't. You don't hold a family together by cutting pieces off it, and if someone told you, in whatever soft voice they used, that you were the piece worth cutting, they were wrong, and somewhere, whether you have the proof in a tin or not, there is a version of your story that was never actually about you being unworthy of love. It was about someone else's math. Was it me? I asked that question for 23 years. There was never anything wrong with me. There was something wrong with the accounting. If this story found something true in you tonight, if there's a version of this sitting in your own family, a person who controlled a narrative the same way Carla controlled a checkbook, I want you to comment the word cards below. Not because I need the number, because I read every one of them. And I think you deserve to say it somewhere that isn't just inside your own head anymore. And if there's a phone call you've been putting off, to a grandparent, an aunt, anyone the story convinced you not to reach for, pause this video and send the message. I waited 23 years for a paper trail to say what I already knew in my chest. Don't make the paper do all the work. Sometimes you get to be the proof yourself today, before there's a will involved at all. If you're new here, this is Betrayal House, and we tell one story like this every week. Quiet people, underestimated for years, who won a war without ever raising their voice. Subscribe if you want the next one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and which piece of my grandmother's story is still sitting with you. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep your own receipts. You never know which year they'll finally matter.